It happened 2 nights before Christmas in the quiet town of Frostwood, a place where the snow always seemed to fall just a little thicker, the nights a little quieter, and the holidays a little more magical, or so people said. Our neighborhood was small, the kind where everyone knew everyone else, and you'd see the same Christmas lights strung up year after year, twinkling like stars in the freezing night. That year, we'd had the biggest snowfall in decades. The snowbanks were so high you could lose sight of the smaller kids if they wandered too far. My little brother, Ethan, had been glued to the window all week, begging Mom to let him outside. He was 6 years old, with an endless supply of energy and an imagination that never seemed to run dry. To him, the world was a stage and he was the star of every show. Tomorrow? Mom kept saying, until finally, the storm passed, and the sun broke through the clouds. On the morning of December 23rd, Ethan practically flew into his snow boots and jacket. "Come on, Jake!" he yelled, tugging at my arm. "We have to build the biggest snowman ever." I groaned. At 16, I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending my morning freezing my fingers off in the yard. But Ethan's excitement was contagious, and it wasn't like I had anything better to do. So we bundled up and headed outside. The snow was perfect, light, powdery, and easy to pack. Ethan decided our snowman needed to be a giant, towering over the yard like some kind of frosty king. We rolled the base until it was so big, I had to help him push it into place. 2 more enormous snowballs followed, each one carefully stacked on top of the last. By the time we were done, the snowman stood taller than me, a hulking figure with stick arms and a crooked smile made from rocks Ethan had scavenged from the driveway. "Perfect," Ethan declared, stepping back to admire our handiwork. "But he needs a name." I shrugged. "Frosty." Ethan shook his head. "Too boring. He's special. He paused, squinting up at the snowman's lopsided grin. "Mr. Cheer." It was such a ridiculous name that I couldn't help laughing. "All right, Mr. Cheer it is." But the way Ethan was staring at the snowman gave me chills. His little face was serious, his blue eyes wide. "He's gonna watch over us," Ethan said quietly. "He'll keep us safe." That night, after dinner, Ethan begged Mom to let him go outside one more time to say goodnight to Mr. Cheer. It was already dark, and the temperature had dropped to the point where even the windows were frosting over, but Ethan was stubborn. Eventually, Mom caved, and I was assigned to go with him. We stepped outside into the bitter cold, our boots crunching in the snow. Ethan sprinted ahead, his breath puffing out in little clouds. Mr. Cheer stood at the edge of the yard, bathed in the pale glow of the street lamp. "Good night, Mr. Cheer," Ethan called, his voice echoing softly in the stillness. Then he reached up and placed his mittened hand against the snowman's chest. "Come on, Ethan," I said, rubbing my arms. "It's freezing." Ethan didn't move. His hand stayed on the snowman, his head tilted as if he were listening to something. "Jake," he whispered. "He's talking." "What?" I laughed nervously. "Who's talking?" "Mr. Cheer," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "He said he needs me." "Ethan, stop messing around," I said, my breath fogging the air. The street lamp flickered faintly, and for a moment, the whole yard felt eerie, like we were the only 2 people left in the world. "It's too cold for this." But Ethan didn't move. His hand was still pressed against Mr. Cheer's chest, and his head turned slightly toward me. "He said he's lonely," Ethan murmured, like he hadn't heard me at all. "He needs a friend." "Yeah, well, he can find one tomorrow," I snapped. "Let's go." Finally, Ethan pulled his hand back, but not before patting the snowman one last time, like you'd pat a dog. "Good night, Mr. Cheer," he said softly, and then he ran back to the house. I followed him inside, relieved to be back in the warmth. Ethan didn't say much during the rest of the evening, which was unusual for him. Normally, he'd be chattering about Santa or begging for just one more Christmas movie. But that night, he just sat by the window, staring out into the yard. When I asked him what he was looking at, he only said, "Mr. Cheer." I didn't think much of it until the next morning. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was buzzing with activity. Mom baking cookies in the kitchen, Dad stringing up extra lights outside. I had planned to sleep in, but something woke me up before sunrise. At first, I thought it was the cold draft from my window, but then I noticed Ethan's bed was empty. "Ethan," I called, sitting up. The room was quiet, the faint hum of the furnace the only sound. I rubbed my eyes and checked under his bed, even though I knew he wasn't there. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind. He never got up before me. "Mom, have you seen Ethan?" I shouted as I ran down the stairs. Mom turned from the oven, her face confused. "No, I thought he was with you." I checked the living room, the bathroom, even the basement. Nothing. My chest tightened as I yanked on my boots and coat and bolted outside. The morning air was sharp and bitter, biting at my face as I stumbled into the yard. "Ethan!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed except for a faint trail of footprints leading toward the edge of the trees behind our house. My stomach dropped. I followed the trail, my heart pounding harder with each step. They were definitely Ethan's footprints, small, uneven, like he'd been running. But as I reached the tree line, the prints stopped abruptly. There was no sign of him, no disturbance in the snow. Just nothing. I looked back toward the house, hoping to see him running out to greet me with some dumb prank smile. But all I saw was the yard, and Mr. Cheer standing tall and silent in the morning light. Something about the snowman seemed different, though. His lopsided grin looked wider now, more sinister, and his stick arms were no longer drooping. They were raised slightly, almost as if he were beckoning someone closer. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crawled down my spine. "Ethan," I called again, my voice trembling. The wind carried my words into the trees, where they faded into an unsettling silence. That's when I noticed something sticking out of the snow near the base of Mr. Cheer. A piece of red fabric. I stepped closer, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. It was Ethan's mitten. I stood there, staring at the mitten half buried in the snow. My throat felt tight, and my breath came in short, panicked bursts. The mitten was damp and cold when I picked it up, the kind of cold that seeps into your skin and lingers. It was definitely Ethan's. Mom had knitted it for him last winter, red with a white stripe at the wrist. "Ethan!" I shouted again, turning in circles, hoping against hope that he'd jump out from behind the snowbank or the trees, laughing at how easily he'd scared me. But there was no sound, no movement, just the stillness of the snow-covered yard. The snowman loomed behind me, casting a long, thin shadow in the weak morning light. I couldn't shake the feeling that his crooked smile was mocking me. Clutching the mitten, I sprinted back into the house. Mom and Dad were already bundling up when I burst through the door, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I'd found. "We're calling the police," Dad said firmly, reaching for his phone. "You stay here with your mother." "No," I shouted, the word coming out louder than I intended. I think he's outside somewhere. We just need to look for him." Dad looked at me, his face a mix of confusion and worry. "Jake, it's freezing out there. And if Ethan's lost in the woods..." Mom cut him off, grabbing her coat and heading toward the door. "I'm not waiting. Jake, show me where you found the mitten." I led her back outside, my boots sinking into the fresh snow as we crossed the yard. The morning was so quiet that every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of snow beneath our feet, the distant creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. When we reached the spot where I'd found the mitten, Mom's face went pale. She knelt down, running her gloved fingers through the snow as if she might uncover something I'd missed. "Ethan!" she called, her voice cracking with desperation. But again there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of where Ethan had gone. Just the mitten and the snow. Mom stood up slowly, her eyes drifting toward the snowman. "Why does it look different?" she murmured, almost to herself. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It's like..." I trailed off, unable to say what I was thinking. It sounded crazy even in my head. She didn't say anything more, but I could tell she felt it too. That strange, uneasy pull toward the snowman. The way it seemed to loom over us. Its grin too wide, its arms too lifelike. "Let's go back," Mom said, her voice trembling. "We'll wait for the police." The next few hours were a blur. The cops arrived, and they didn't waste any time combing through the woods with dogs and flashlights. Neighbors showed up too, bundled in coats and scarves, calling Ethan's name as they trudged through the snow. But as the hours dragged on, their voices grew quieter, their movements slower, until one by one, they started heading home. By sunset, there was still no sign of Ethan. That night, the house felt unbearably quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak and groan sound like something lurking just out of sight. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that snowman's grin, and I swear, I could hear Ethan's voice faintly in the back of my mind, calling my name. At some point, I got up and went to the window. The yard was bathed in moonlight, and there, standing at the edge of the shadows, was Mr. Cheer. His arms were raised higher now. His grin stretched so wide it almost split his face in two. And I swear, though I still don't know if it was a trick of the light or something worse, I saw something small and pale sticking out of his chest. Something that looked like a hand. Couldn't breathe. My hand clenched the edge of the curtain so tightly it hurt, but I couldn't look away. The snowman stood eerily still, its shadow stretching long across the yard in the moonlight. My heart was pounding, each beat so loud I thought it might wake the whole house. It wasn't a hand. Couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself over and over, like some desperate mantra. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, my legs wouldn't move, and my eyes stayed locked on Mr. Cheer. Finally, I tore myself away from the window and stumbled back to bed, pulling the blanket over my head like a scared little kid. I told myself I'd imagined it, that by morning, everything would make sense again. But it didn't. The next morning, the air in the house was heavy, weighed down by the absence of Ethan. Mom hadn't stopped crying since the search was called off for the night, and Dad had barely spoken a word. I couldn't bring myself to eat breakfast, my stomach twisting every time I thought about that snowman. Around noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see for myself, had to prove that there was nothing wrong, that it was just my imagination running wild. While Mom and Dad were distracted talking to the police again, I slipped on my coat and boots and headed outside. The yard was eerily quiet, the snow untouched except for the faint footprints from yesterday. Mr. Cheer still stood in his spot, his grin frozen in place. But as I got closer, I felt a strange heaviness settle over me, like the air itself was pressing down on my chest. And then I saw it. There, sticking out of the snowman's chest, was something small and pale. My heart raced as I reached out, my hand trembling. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't a hand. It was a piece of fabric, a scrap of white cloth, frayed at the edges. I pulled it free, my breath catching in my throat. It was Ethan's scarf, the one he'd been wearing when he disappeared. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. The scarf fell from my hands, landing in the snow like a splash of blood. No, no, no. The snowman seemed to tower over me now, its shadow stretching impossibly long in the midday sun. And then I heard it, a faint, whispering sound, like whined through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. "Jake!" I froze. The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but I knew it. It was Ethan. "Jake." The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." My blood ran cold. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Just the empty yard and the towering figure of Mr. Cheer. "Ethan," I called, my voice breaking. "Where are you?" The snowman seemed to loom closer, though I hadn't seen it move. Its grin looked sharper now, almost predatory, and its coal eyes seemed to glint with a faint, malevolent light. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't tell my parents what I'd seen. How could I? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd start looking at me the way they used to look at Ethan when he talked about imaginary friends and monsters in the closet. But that night, I couldn't stay in the house. Not with the memory of that voice, that scarf, haunting me. So, after everyone went to bed, I grabbed a flashlight and crept outside. The yard was deathly still, the air so cold it burned my lungs. Mr. Cheer stood in his spot, motionless and silent, his shadow stretching long across the snow. But as I approached, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Something small and dark at the base of the snowman. It was a shoe. Ethan's shoe. My hands were shaking as I picked up the shoe. It was soaked and stiff with frost, but there was no mistaking it. It was Ethan's. The Velcro strap, the worn sole, the tiny doodle of a dinosaur he'd scribbled on the side with a marker. It was all there. Ethan? I whispered, the name catching in my throat. I turned toward the snowman, the flashlight trembling in my grip. Its grin seemed wider now, the rocks forming its mouth jagged and uneven. The stick arms were raised even higher, like it was reaching for something or someone. I knew what I had to do, even though every instinct screamed at me to run back to the house and pretend I'd never seen any of it. But I couldn't leave Ethan, not if there was even the slightest chance he was out here somewhere. Dropping to my knees, I started digging. My fingers clawed at the snow, the icy chill biting through my gloves. I didn't know what I was looking for, but the snow around the base of Mr. Cheer felt different, harder, packed down like it had been disturbed. As I dug deeper, my flashlight beam flickered over something dark in the snow. My heart leapt into my throat. It was more fabric, blue this time. Ethan's jacket. Ethan! I shouted, my voice raw and desperate. I dug faster, ignoring the burn in my hands and the way the snow seemed to suck the heat from my body. The jacket was buried deep, and as I pulled it free, I felt the unmistakable weight of something solid underneath. That's when I heard the whisper again. Jake! It was louder now, more distinct. The voice wasn't coming from the trees or the wind. It was coming from the snowman. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows across the yard. For a split second, I thought I saw the snowman's grin move, its coal eyes narrowing like it was watching me. Help me? The voice whispered, and this time, it wasn't just a sound. It was a plea. I should have run. Every rational part of me knew I should have gotten up and sprinted back to the house. But Ethan's voice pulled me forward, compelling me to keep digging, to uncover whatever was hidden beneath the snow. Finally, my fingers scraped against something solid. It was cold and smooth, and as I cleared away the last layer of snow, I realized what it was, a door. It was made of old, weathered wood, the kind you'd expect to find in a root cellar or a storm shelter. I hadn't even known there was anything like this in our yard. A rusty iron ring served as the handle, and as I gripped it, a jolt of icy pain shot through my hand, making me gasp. Jake! The voice came again, more insistent this time. I'm here. I didn't hesitate. Using all my strength, I pulled the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. A rush of freezing air poured out, carrying with it a strange, metallic smell that made my stomach churn. The beam of my flashlight barely pierced the darkness below. The hole was deep, much deeper than it should have been. Far deeper than any cellar or shelter could realistically go. I couldn't see the bottom, but I could feel it. Presence waiting in the shadows. And then, from somewhere far below, I heard Ethan's voice again. Help me, Jake. I leaned over the edge, my heart pounding. Ethan, I called, my voice echoing back at me. Are you down there? There was no answer, just the faint sound of wind swirling in the depths. But as I stared into the blackness, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. The yard was empty, but the snowman, Mr. Cheer, was closer now. I was sure of it. He stood just a few feet away, his coal eyes fixed on me, his grin so wide it seemed to split his entire head in half. And then, slowly, his stick arm began to move. The stick arm moved with an unnatural slowness, creaking as if straining against the frozen air. It wasn't just swaying in the wind, it was deliberate, purposeful. The jagged branch pointed toward the open door in the ground, almost like an invitation. Jake! The voice came again, faint and muffled, but undeniably Ethan's. It echoed up from the darkness below, a sound so fragile it made my chest ache. Please! I didn't think. Couldn't. The fear, the cold, the impossibility of everything happening. It all faded away when I heard my brother's voice. I grabbed the flashlight, ignoring the way my hands trembled, and stepped toward the hole. The air around the door was colder than anything I'd ever felt, so cold it made my skin burn and my breath freeze in my throat. I aimed the flashlight down, but the beam seemed to get swallowed by the blackness. The smell, metallic, damp, and faintly sweet, grew stronger, making my stomach churn. "I'm coming, Ethan," I shouted, lowering myself onto the first rung of a rusted metal ladder that I hadn't seen until now. The rungs were slick with frost, and the metal bit into my gloves as I began my descent. Above me, the snowman loomed, its coal eyes watching silently. The ladder stretched on forever. The deeper I went, the more the world above seemed to fade away. The snowman, the yard, the house. It all felt like a distant memory. The walls around me were rough stone, slick with ice and lined with jagged roots that curled like claws. My flashlight barely lit the way, the beam flickering as if struggling to stay alive. "Ethan," I called again, my voice echoing endlessly. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, shallow and ragged. And then, faintly, I heard it. "Jake, hurry." I quickened my pace, climbing down as fast as I could without slipping. The metallic smell was almost overpowering now, and the air felt thick like it was pressing down on me. My foot slipped on a rung, and I nearly lost my grip, the flashlight tumbling from my hand. It fell into the abyss below, its light spinning wildly before disappearing completely. I froze, clinging to the ladder as darkness swallowed me. My breaths came in panicked gasps, and I felt the crushing weight of the void below. And then I saw it, a faint, pale light far beneath me, flickering like a candle in the wind. It wasn't the flashlight, it was something else, something alive. The light pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. "Jake," the voice came again, clearer now. "I'm here. Don't leave me." "Ethan," I shouted, my voice cracking. I pushed past my fear and climbed toward the light, the ladder groaning under my weight. The pulsing glow grew stronger, illuminating a cavernous space below. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, mixing with the acrid stench of decay. When I finally reached the bottom, I dropped onto a floor of smooth, icy stone. The pale light filled the cavern, but its source was unclear. There was no lantern, no bulb, just an ambient glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And in the center of the cavern, surrounded by jagged shards of ice, was Ethan. He was standing perfectly still, his back to me, his small frame bathed in the pale light. His red scarf was gone, his jacket torn, and his hair was damp with frost. "Ethan," I called, running toward him. My boots echoed on the stone, the sound bouncing endlessly off the cavern walls. "Ethan, it's me." He didn't move. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched his shoulder. His skin was ice cold, his body rigid. "Ethan, look at me," I pleaded, shaking him gently. Slowly, he turned. I stumbled back, a scream catching in my throat. It was Ethan, but his face was wrong. His blue eyes, once so full of life, were dull and lifeless, like glass marbles. Frost clung to his eyelashes, and his lips were cracked and bloodless, twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. "Jake," he whispered, his voice flat and hollow. "You shouldn't have come." My legs felt like they were rooted to the icy stone floor. Ethan's words hung in the frigid air, and the sight of him, so familiar, yet so terribly wrong, made my stomach churn. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. What happened to you?" He tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to remember how to respond. The glassy emptiness in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. "He brought me here," Ethan said, his voice soft and distant, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. "He said I could stay forever." "Who?" I asked, stepping closer despite the dread clawing at my chest. "Who brought you here?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted past me, toward the ladder I just descended. Slowly, his lips moved, forming a single word. "Him." A faint sound echoed through the cavern, like ice cracking under pressure, sharp and deliberate. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The ladder I'd climbed down was gone, replaced by a wall of jagged ice. And standing at the edge of the cavern, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its body was wrapped in tattered, frost-covered fabric, like the remnants of a once elegant coat. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was hidden beneath a hood of ice, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and unforgiving. And then it smiled. The grin was wide and jagged, its teeth like shards of frozen glass. It looked almost familiar. My stomach twisted as I realized why. It was the same smile I'd seen on Mr. Cheer. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking as I stepped protectively in front of Ethan. My fists clenched at my sides, even though I knew there was nothing I could do against whatever this thing was. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one long, skeletal arm and pointed at Ethan. "He's mine now," the figure said, its voice low and resonant, echoing through the cavern like a distant avalanche. "No!" I shouted, the word tearing from my throat. "You can't have him." The figure tilted its head, the icy hood shifting slightly. "He came willingly," it said, the grin never faltering. "He heard my call, felt my loneliness." I glanced back at Ethan, who was still standing motionless, his lifeless eyes fixed on the creature. My heart ached at the sight of him, so small and fragile, so far from the vibrant, mischievous little brother I knew. "He didn't know what he was doing," I said, my voice trembling. "He's just a kid. Let him go." The figure's grin widened, impossibly so, and the cavern seemed to grow colder. "A trade," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You may take him, if you stay." "What?" I whispered, my blood running cold. "You," the figure said, stepping closer. Its movements were slow and deliberate, each step sending a faint tremor through the ground. "Stay. Be mine. And he goes free." I looked at Ethan, my mind racing. I didn't know what this thing wanted or what it would do to me if I agreed, but I knew one thing for certain. Couldn't leave him here. "Jake," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "Don't." The creature let out a low, hollow laugh, the sound reverberating through the cavern like a haunting melody. "Decide," it said, its skeletal hand reaching out toward me. "The choice is yours." I stood frozen, the creature's words ringing in my ears. "A trade," it had said, "my life for Ethan's." The cavern felt like it was closing in, the icy walls pressing down as I struggled to breathe. Ethan's glassy eyes flickered with the faintest trace of something. Fear, or maybe hope. "Jake, don't," he whispered again, his voice trembling. "You can't." I looked at him, my little brother, the one who always needed me to protect him. How could I walk away now? "Ethan," I said, forcing the words past the lump in my throat. "I can't leave you here." The creature took another step forward, its skeletal fingers beckoning. "Choose," it hissed, the grin splitting wider. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at me. "Take me instead." The creature's grin widened until it seemed to split its frozen face in half. "Good," it whispered, the word hanging in the cold air like a distant echo. "Come forward." I hesitated for the briefest moment, my instincts screaming at me to run. But Ethan's hollow gaze met mine, and I knew I couldn't turn back. I took a step toward the creature, the frost-covered stone biting through the soles of my boots. "Jake, no," Ethan cried, his voice trembling. "You can't." "It's okay," I said, forcing a steadiness into my voice that I didn't feel. "I've got this." I reached out, my hand trembling as the creature extended its skeletal fingers. The moment its icy touch met my skin, a searing cold shot through my body, worse than anything I'd ever felt. My knees buckled, and I gasped as the air seemed to be pulled from my lungs. The creature's voice echoed inside my head now, dark and ancient. "You will stay," it whispered, "and he will go." I managed a weak nod, barely able to keep my balance. The cold was spreading through me like venom, rooting me in place. I glanced back at Ethan, desperate to see him one last time, but the cavern was already shifting. The pale light dimmed, the shadows growing thicker, swirling like a living thing. "No!" Ethan shouted, his small figure breaking free from whatever had held him back. He ran toward me, his arms outstretched. "Don't take him." The creature's head turned sharply, its grin vanishing. "This was not your choice," it hissed, its voice reverberating like a crack of thunder. With a flick of its bony hand, Ethan was thrown backward, landing hard against the icy ground. "Ethan!" I screamed, fighting against the creature's grip, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my limbs locked in place as the darkness closed in. The creature leaned closer, its breath a chilling mist against my face. "You are mine now," it said, its voice a rasping whisper. Suddenly, a sound cut through the air, soft at first, like whine through the trees, but growing louder with every passing second. It was Ethan's voice, but not in words. It was a scream, raw and piercing, filled with all the fear and desperation he'd been holding back. The sound echoed through the cavern, shaking the walls and shattering the shadows around us. The creature recoiled, its grin faltering for the first time. Its grip on me loosened, and I felt a rush of warmth, brief, fleeting, but enough to move. I turned toward Ethan, who was lying on the ground, his small hands clutching the icy stone as tears streamed down his face. "Ethan!" I shouted. "Run! Get out of here!" He looked up at me, his expression filled with both determination and fear. "Not without you!" he cried, his voice cracking. The creature let out a furious roar, its skeletal form stretching unnaturally as it lunged for Ethan. My mind screamed with panic as I did the only thing I could. I threw myself into its path, grabbing its icy arm with every ounce of strength I had left. "No!" I shouted, my voice echoing with raw desperation. "Take me, not him. That's the deal." The creature froze, its jagged grin reappearing slowly. "So brave," it murmured, its voice thick with mockery. "So foolish." It raised its other hand, and the shadows swirled around us again, colder and darker than before. I felt myself being pulled into the abyss, the cavern spinning away into nothingness. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was Ethan's tear-streaked face as he reached for me, his voice calling my name. And then silence. I woke to the sound of wind howling and the sting of cold against my face. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a gray sky, and I realized I was lying in the middle of the yard. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy and stiff, and looked around. The snowman, Mr. Cheer, was gone. Nothing remained but a patch of churned-up snow where he had stood. "Jake!" Ethan's voice cut through the cold. I turned just in time to see him barreling toward me, his small figure bundled in his jacket and scarf. His cheeks were red, his breath coming in frantic puffs as he threw his arms around me. "You're okay!" he cried, his voice muffled against my coat. I held him tightly, too overwhelmed to speak. He felt warm, alive, and real. It didn't make sense. I'd seen him lifeless and cold in that cavern, but here he was, trembling in my arms. "You were gone," he said, pulling back just enough to look at me. His blue eyes brimmed with tears. "I thought I'd lost you." I swallowed hard, brushing the snow from his hair. "I thought I'd lost you too." For a moment we just stood there, the snow falling softly around us. The memory of the creature's jagged grin lingered in my mind, but I pushed it aside. We were safe. Ethan was safe. But as we walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Mr. Cheer grinning at me from the edge of the yard. There was nothing. Still, the air felt heavier, colder. And when we reached the porch, Ethan paused, turning to me with a look that sent a chill down my spine. "Jake," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "He's not gone," he said. "He'll come back." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Instead, I pulled him inside and locked the door behind us, silently praying that he was wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. Somewhere, beneath the snow and ice, the creature was waiting, watching, and it wasn't done with us yet.